Few people are more revered and trusted as those in the medical profession. This is especially true of medical doctors, who we entrust with our health care and often even our lives. They take the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm and to serve humanity. However, throughout history, there have been those medical professionals who were proven to have had a dark side, which shocks their communities and often leaves more questions than answers as to why. And the UK had its share of killer doctors. However, for decades, one doctor in England lived a Jekyll and Hyde existence, and his list of crimes was staggering, and the numbers of possible victims was unbelievable, surpassing any other previous domestic serial killer in Great Britain. His trial was Great Britain's trial of the century, and was the most covered subject at that time by every newspaper and television news outlet as they followed the case of Britain's most successful and prolific serial killer who worked under the guise of palliative care and went undetected for over a quarter century. Who was Dr. Harold Shipman? What were his crimes? How long did he practice and commit these crimes? What was the end result of his actions? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Harold Frederick Shipman was born January 14, 1946 on the Brestwood Estate, a council estate in Nottingham, England, the second of three children. His father, also Harold Frederick Shipman, was a lorry driver, and his mother was named Vera. Shipman's mother died of lung cancer when he was 17 years of age on June 21, 1963, and he was very close to her, and it may have impacted his early development. Ironically, her death was very similar to Shipman's own methods of handling his elderly patients because, in the later stages of her disease, she was given morphine administered at home by a doctor, which eased her pain, which subsided until she passed away. Shipman married Primrose May Oxtoby on November 5, 1966, and they had 4 children, during which time Shipman studied medicine at the University of Leeds School of Medicine, graduating as an MD in 1970. Shipman's first work assignment and residency was at the Pontefract General Infirmary at Pontefract, West Riding of Yorkshire, and in 1974 he became a general practitioner at the Abraham Ormerod Medical Center in Todmorden. Shipman developed an opioid addiction and was caught forging prescriptions of pethidine, which is also known as meperidine, and sold under the brand name Demerol, among others, for his own use in 1975. Shipman was fined £600 and briefly attended a drug rehabilitation clinic in York, and upon completion, his license was restored, and he worked at Donnybrook Medical Center in Hyde, Greater Manchester, in 1977 throughout the 1980s. He established his own private surgery at 21 Market Street in 1993 and was a highly regarded member of the local community. But all was not well because, in March 1998, Linda Reynolds, a general practitioner at the Brook Surgery in Hyde, was concerned with the high rate of death of Shipman's patients, and she brought her concerns to John Pollard, the coroner for the South Manchester District. She was most concerned about the large number of cremation forms ordered for Shipman's elderly women patients that were required to be countersigned. The police were notified and investigated, but at that time they could not find sufficient evidence to bring charges and closed their investigation on April 17, 1998. Later, the Shipman Inquiry blamed Greater Manchester Police for assigning inexperienced officers to the case. Shipman then went on to kill 3 more people after the investigation was closed, and suspicions arose again. A few months later, in August 1998, taxi driver John Shaw told the police that he suspected Shipman of murdering 21 patients. This was because Shaw was the taxi driver and had taken many of the elderly patients to the hospital, and they seemed to be in very good health, but later died after seeing Shipman. Shipman's last victim was a patient named Kathleen Grundy. She was a former mayor of Hyde who was found dead in her home on June 24, 1998, and Shipman was the last person to see her alive, and he later signed her death certificate recording the cause of death as old age. However, Grundy's daughter Solicitor Angela Woodruff became concerned when fellow solicitor Brian Burgess told her that he had become aware that a will had apparently been drafted and signed by her mother, and there were serious allegations and doubts about its authenticity. What made the alarm bells go off was that Kathleen Grundy already had a pre-existing will, and the family had copies, but the new will excluded Woodruff and her children, leaving almost £400,000 to Shipman as the lone beneficiary. Woodruff then went to the police, who began an investigation into both Grundy's death and examining the will. Grundy's body was exhumed and found to contain traces of heroin, often used for pain control in terminally ill cancer patients. When questioned, Shipman claimed that Grundy had been an addict and showed them comments he had written to that effect in his computerized medical journal. The police examined his computer, which proved that the entries on Grundy were written long after her death, not a patient log over a period of time. Shipman was arrested on the forgery charge after a search of his home revealed the very same Brother typewriter that the forged will had been written on, as well as matching paper. They also found a large number of morphine bottles, which, being a controlled substance, should not have been in his home. As a result of both the autopsy on Grundy and the forgery, Shipman was arrested on September 7, 1998. The 2000 book, Prescription for Murder, by journalists Brian Whittle and Gene Ritchie, believed that Shipman forged the will because he felt his life was out of control and wanted to be caught, or perhaps because he planned to retire at age 55 and leave the UK. The police then launched an investigation into other patient deaths that Shipman had certified and investigated 15 specific cases, and they discovered a pattern of his giving patients lethal doses of dimorphine, signing patients' death certificates, and then falsifying medical records to indicate that they had been in poor health. It was determined that from 1990 to 1997 was when most of the deaths occurred, with about 20 to 25 deaths attributed directly to him. Shipman's trial was the largest news event in Britain, and on January 31, 2000, he was convicted of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery, receiving 15 life sentences to be served consecutively. Shipman was convicted for murdering the following patients: but that was not the end of the investigation. In January 2001, West Yorkshire Police Detective Chris Gregg was selected to head an investigation into 22 of the deaths. This investigation would become known as the Shipman Inquiry, submitted in July 2002, which concluded that he had killed at least 218 of his patients between 1975 and 1998, during which time he practiced in Todmorden and Hyde. Shipman was compared to SS Dr. Joseph Mengele, who killed his patients, and please see our video on him, but this is not a proper comparison given the differences in both cases, and for obvious reasons. The report also speculated that the actual number of murdered patients could be as high as 260 to 280, but due to cremation and the passage of time, that could not be proven. Prosecutors were waiting for that report to determine if Shipman could be tried again for the additional deaths. Dame Janet Smith, the judge who submitted the report, admitted that many more deaths of a suspicious nature could not be definitively ascribed to Shipman, although most of his victims were elderly women in relative good health. In 2003, as the dust settled, it was determined that statistical monitoring could have led to an alarm being raised at the end of 1996 when there were 67 excess deaths in females aged over 65 years compared with 119 by 1998. In addition, the circumstantial evidence showed an abnormally large number of the deaths occurred around the same time of day when Shipman embarked upon his afternoon visits to visit his patients in their homes. But as a result of the investigation, Shipman was not the only doctor charged with crimes, as 6 more doctors he worked with were charged with misconduct for signing cremation forms for Shipman's victims. The authorities claimed that they should have noticed the pattern between Shipman's home visits and his patients' deaths. All these doctors were later found not guilty of criminal misconduct, but they were chastised for not being diligent. As a result of his sentence, it was presumed that Shipman would die in prison, but there would be a twist. Shipman had refused to take part in therapy sessions which would have encouraged acknowledgement of his crimes, and his failure to do so and participate saw him lose a few privileges, including calling his wife. His wife, Primrose, had consistently believed in his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence, but later it was believed that she began to suspect that he was in fact guilty. According to Shipman's cellmate, prior to his death, he received a letter from Primrose requesting him to tell me everything no matter what. His wife received his full National Health Service pension that she would not have been entitled to if Shipman had lived past age 60. Shipman hanged himself in his prison cell on January 13, 2004. Shipman's motive for self-termination was never clearly established, though he reportedly told his probation officer that he was considering self-termination to assure his wife's financial security after he was stripped of his National Health Service pension. After Shipman's body was released to his family, it remained in Sheffield for over a year. The police advised Primrose Shipman against burying her husband in case the grave was vandalized out of revenge, so his body was finally cremated and was attended only by Primrose and the couple's 4 children. But how did he get away with the killing for so long? The investigation was still far from over. The Shipman Inquiry, led by Dame Janet Smith, concluded Shipman likely killed at least 215 patients, and in her 6th and final report, published on January 24, 2005, Smith believed that Shipman had killed 3 additional patients, with suspicions about a 4th additional death, including a 4-year-old girl early in his medical career at Pontefract General Infirmary. In total, it was determined that 459 people died while under his care between 1971 and 1998, but it is uncertain how many of those were murder victims, as he was often the only doctor to certify the death. Smith's own estimate of Shipman's total victim count over that 27-year period was 250, but some say 286. In 2005, it was discovered that Shipman may have stolen jewelry from many of his victims. During the search of Shipman's home in 1998, police had seized over 10,000 pounds worth of jewelry hidden in his garage. Police wrote to the families of Shipman's confirmed victims and even others who died without evidence of murder, asking them to identify the jewelry. The unidentified items were handed over to the Assets Recovery Agency in May, which ended that investigation in August. 66 pieces of jewelry were returned to Primrose Shipman, who had requested that they be returned, and the 33 pieces of jewelry that she confirmed were not hers and were not claimed by the families of the victims were auctioned off, with the proceeds going to the Tameside Victim Support. The only piece returned to a murdered patient's family was a platinum diamond ring, for which that family submitted a photograph of their family member wearing the ring as proof of ownership. In October 2005, another hearing was held against 2 doctors who worked at Tameside General Hospital in 1994 because they failed to detect and report that Shipman had deliberately administered grossly excessive doses of morphine with no accountability for the narcotic being removed from the controlled location and later found in his home. A memorial garden was created and dedicated to Shipman's victims called the Garden of Tranquility in Hyde Park on July 30, 2005. As of early 2009, families of over 200 of the victims of Shipman were still seeking compensation. In September 2009, letters Shipman wrote in prison to friends were going to be sold at auction because the proceeds would benefit the families, but that was not to be the case, and following complaints from victims' relatives and the media, the morbid auction was canceled. The Shipman case and the Shipman report completely changed how the National Health Service in Great Britain operated and led to radical changes, which has been called the Shipman effect. This was especially true regarding the dispensation of narcotics. The case also changed death certification practices and methods, with the largest change being eliminating single doctor general practices to multiple doctor general practices for a peer review method, although this change was not a requirement or even a recommendation. But it was created because the report stated that there were not enough doctors to safeguard and monitor individual medical decisions. In addition, the cremation forms needed in England and Wales have had their questions altered as a direct result of the Shipman case. For example, the person or persons organizing the funeral must answer, "Do you know or suspect that the death of the person who has died was violent or unnatural? Do you consider that there should be any further examination of the remains of the person who has died?" cremation on demand was over. The Shipman case was also unique in that to date, Dr. Harold Shipman, also known as Dr. Death and the Angel of Death, is the only British doctor to have been convicted of murdering patients, although other doctors such as Isiaka Maman have been charged and later acquitted of similar crimes or convicted of lesser charges. Regardless of other cases, Dr. Harold Shipman remains the greatest established serial killer in British history. And worldwide, he has few rivals. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.